To me, there's almost nothing worse than opening up a song and hearing this. So that was programmed drums with all of the velocities maxed out 100%, completely robotic and inhuman. And to me, this can be a real downfall of self-producing your music, is having things sound inhuman, right? You're dealing with a lot of virtual instruments. It's really great. It's an awesome tool to be able to create your own music. There's no way that I would be able to put out all the music that I have these last couple of years if I didn't have all these virtual instruments. But one thing I like to do is try to make them sound as human as possible, especially in the drums. I don't have the resources all the time to hire a drummer and record drums, and then you have to deal with the recording of live drums, which is a pain. So I love having virtual drums, but I want to try to make them sound as much like a real drummer as possible. So in this video, I'm going to show you a couple of tips that I use to make things sound more realistic with your programmed drums. Now, this is focused mostly on composition and programming. I'm not going to talk about mixing in this video, although that can play a really big part into how your drums sound as well. But if you get the composition right from the beginning, then even on the back end part, whether you're mixing it or someone else, that's going to make it sound a little more human. So let's dive into my newest single, Paramnesia, and see a couple of the things that I did to make this sound a little bit more like a real drummer. The first tip I have, and this is maybe the most important one, is to listen to great drummers and learn from great drummers. Even if you're not a drummer like myself, I'm a guitar player, but I've spent hundreds of hours on YouTube learning from drummers. There's lessons from some of the best drummers in the world on YouTube. It's an incredible resource. And by watching great drummers and learning how they groove, what instruments they're playing, what cymbals they use, when they're doing fills, some of the accents they use within their grooves, all of that has helped me to program drums better, helps me to kind of think like a drummer when I'm writing this stuff out, instead of just here I'm doubling the guitar part with the backbeat. That's a great place to start, but getting into the nitty-gritty of where are the drummers doing ghost notes, where are they accenting things, when are they doing dynamics, all that stuff can make a huge difference when you're programming. The next step is, if it's possible, learn how to play some drums yourself. I don't have a kit with me at the moment, but in the past I have. And I've learned how to play basic grooves and just get a feel for how the instrument is laid out physically. And that can help a lot. Even if you don't get good on the drums, you can understand how the instrument works and think about the things that make sense from a physical perspective. Because a lot of times I'll hear programmed drums that are doing things that are impossible on the drums. Not necessarily speed-wise, because a lot of drummers can play super fast, but for instance, 2 cymbals and a snare at the same time. Now, a drummer only has 2 hands. They can't do that on the drums, right? So if I hear something like that, that's an instant giveaway that someone doesn't really know how to program drums properly. Instead, you could do 2 cymbals and a kick, or maybe a cymbal and a snare and a kick, but you can't do all 3 of those at once because it's physically impossible. You don't have the limbs to do it. And also think about how the instrument's laid out. I mean, there's a reason certain things work on the drums. For instance, fills that go down the toms. It's something that lines up on the drums well. And obviously you can jump around a lot with fills, and great drummers do that. But there's a reason that things happen the way they do. So studying great drummers and studying drum transcriptions and trying to get a handle on what drummers actually do is a really good way to start down the path to programming drums. One last thing you can do is to take some of your favorite drummers, pick a groove or 2, and try to program them to sound as much as possible like the real drummer. So get in there with the dynamics, try to figure out exactly where they're doing all the ghost notes, where the accents are happening. That's another great way to start programming realistic sounding drums. The second tip is to write drum parts that fit the song, that highlight certain elements of a riff or a melody, dynamics in the parts that are building with the song. So if it's a quieter section of the song, have the dynamics quieter. If there's big things that are important to hit, make sure you're accenting those with cymbals or snares. All of that stuff can make the drums feel like part of the composition instead of just kind of grooving over the top of it. So let's take a look at the beginning of the song Paramnesia here. Here's the beginning of Paramnesia, and this first verse is quieter, and this is the kick and snare I have highlighted. Look at the velocities. They're lower in this section. And then when it gets to the chorus, they're going to get louder. So let's listen to that. Here's part of the verse. And here comes the chorus. So those parts are building dynamically with the song. I have it quieter, and there's also some kind of mixing stuff in there too, where I bring the volume down during the verse. But just in the programming and the velocities, I take them down during the verse, and then when they kick into the chorus, it adds that extra dynamic level to it. But also notice that here I have the hi-hats really loud, velocity-wise, and that's because the hi-hat is really kind of giving the groove here. So it's important for that to be a little bit louder, so listen to the groove. And this part is syncing up with the bass guitar. If I play the drums and bass together, you'll get an idea of how that sounds. It's the classic line up the kick drum and the bass guitar together. It always works. And I don't do this 100% of the time, but it is something that I'll do a lot. Or either lining up the kick drum with the heavy rhythm guitars too in a metal context. That works really well. But notice how those things are locking together. The bass and drums are locking together because the drums and bass are written in such a way that they're going to work together to complement each other. And those accents in the hi-hat are helping a lot with that too, and also the dynamics. So if we go from the chorus, verse to the chorus, just with drums and bass. Notice how those drums are getting louder when the chorus kicks in. Of course, the bass tone changes too. And all of that stuff can help to make the song more dynamic. Here's another example of how the drums are accenting certain parts in this song. This is in the second verse, and this is just the drums and lead guitar. This is kind of like a solo section. Listen to how the drums are playing along with some of these runs in the guitar part. Especially that last run, the drums are going along with that faster part, and it just adds a lot of intensity into the next section. I could have just had the drums groove here, and I think originally I did, but once I got into the song, I realized that I needed the drums to build up this part even more and to catch part of that, and it really ramps it up into this next part, which everything drops out on. One more part to look at here where the drums are highlighting something from the song. This is a heavy riff in the middle of the song, and this feels like 4/4. Now, it's not actually 4/4. If you watched my video on time signature Inception, you'll know what's going on here. But I could have just had the drums do a basic rock beat, right, with the backbeats on 2 and 4. But instead, I have the snare drum highlighting certain parts of this riff to kind of bring out the interesting syncopation of the riff. So here's just the drums and the rhythm guitars on this part. That's adding a lot to this riff instead of just do-ka, having those snare drums hitting those important parts of the riff. So there's some examples of things you can do from a composition perspective. Now, the best thing you can do is just to study this and to practice it. The only way you're going to get good at doing this is to actually do it. It took me years and years to get to the point where I can write drum grooves that I think feel okay. If you want to start from the beginning, I do have a lesson on basic drum grooves for this style of music specifically. It's a fairly detailed lesson. Starts with some really straightforward rock grooves and goes into some more complicated stuff. And I'll link that down below if you want to check that out. But the best thing you can do is to study great drummers and to practice writing drum grooves. It's just like playing guitar or just like playing bass. If you don't practice doing it, if you don't practice programming drums or practice writing drum grooves, you're never going to get better at it. So it's just something that takes time with trial and error. And I can see the progress within myself if I look back on my older music, like how much better I've gotten, especially even in the last couple of years at programming drums. Now let's talk about a couple of things we can do from a programming perspective. The first tip I have for the programming process is to not max out the velocities. An instant giveaway to really bad programmed drums is 100% velocities, especially on super fast parts like a blast beat or a really fast double kick. That's just not human at all because drummers cannot do that. The faster you start to play, the smaller your movements get and the quieter they get, right? So a real drummer doing blast beats, it gets quieter. Like the snare hits get quieter and the double kick hits get quieter. So if I hear blast beats with like really maxed out drums, it's kind of a giveaway that the person programming doesn't really know what they're doing. So what I do as a starting point is get my drums somewhere around the 80 to 90% velocity. Now I'm in Studio One, which uses percentages. A lot of DAWs will use 0 to 127, so that would be somewhere between 100 and 110. And that's kind of a good starting point. You get nice loud hits, but it doesn't sound inhuman. Very rarely does a drummer hit as hard as they can. There might be specific sections where you're like, hey, I want to flam a snare drum hit as hard as possible. But overall, this gets nice loud hits, the 80 to 90%, but they still sound somewhat human. Now the next step I do is to grab everything, and I'll do this humanize function, and I'll do the velocities up or down anywhere from 5 to 10%. That's just going to create a little bit of randomness to it. That way not every single snare drum hit, for example, is the exact same velocity, because real drummers can't do that. No matter how consistent they are, no drummer's going to be able to hit the exact same velocity every single time. So a little bit of that randomness makes it sound more human. And then if something gets weird during that process, if something gets pulled down more than I want from the humanize function, I'll just go in and grab that and bring it back up. So that's a really good place to start, that I think anyway. It's worked well for me. It gives you a little bit more realistic sounding drums without even doing any of the finer detail stuff, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that brings me to the next step, which is to get really detailed with the velocities. Let's take a look at this hi-hat part at the beginning, and you'll see that this one's 92%, this one's 66%. And what I'm doing is to have accented hi-hats that are going along with the subdivision of this particular rhythm. Now in a basic 4/4 groove, a drummer, if they were playing eighth notes on the hi-hat, would accent the downbeat and then do a quieter note on the offbeat. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and an amateur drummer would play them all the same velocity. So if you want to make program drums sound more realistic, this is a very tedious process, but you go in, you grab this note, make sure it's louder, and grab this one and bring it down. And then you go through the whole groove, whatever the groove happens to be, and make sure that things are accented where they make sense. As I mentioned earlier, like this beginning section, I have the drums kick and snare quieter. Then when we get to the chorus, I bring them up, and then I bring them back down a little bit for this second verse. Just trying to follow the dynamics of the song. I also will choose certain notes to make louder, like some of these cymbal hits that are happening at the beginning of these chorus parts that are really important. I'll bring up the velocities because a drummer would hit cymbal hits really hard going into a new section. That's pretty common to do. That kind of makes the beginning of a part feel really epic, like here. That first cymbal hit really nice and loud into this next groove kind of hits you right off the bat when it comes in. I might bring up certain kick drum hits, in a section that has a lot of double kick, not to the point where they sound inhuman, but just to the place where they're going to come through a little bit more. Or there's some hi-hat grooves where maybe I would choose different sounds of hi-hats. In the drums I'm using here, which are Modern and Massive by Get Good Drums, they have different hi-hat options, right? So more closed and more open. And I can go back and forth between those. For a little bit of variety, like a drummer would actually do, maybe opening and closing the hi-hat as they're playing. The last thing I want to talk about from the programming side of the drums are ghost notes. Now, ghost notes are notes that are played quietly on the snare drum, and they usually happen between the main snare drum hits. A good rule of thumb to begin with is the ghost notes happening in spaces. For example, on this opening groove, I have a ghost note that happens in this space here. This is the ghost note. There's no hi-hat playing, there's no kick drum, there's no other drum hit at all. So that ghost note's going to fill in that space. And ghost notes, what I do with them is put them anywhere between 30 and 40%, depending on how much I want them to be heard. That way they're happening and they're there, you can hear them, but they're not popping out too much. They're just filling in the space and adding more of a human element to it. And real drummers and good drummers, they use ghost notes all the time. Some, like, to a crazy extent how much people use ghost notes. Let's take a look at a part of the song where I use a lot more ghost notes. That's during this crazy, weird thumping part. And these ghost notes I actually brought up in volume quite a bit because I wanted to add to the intensity of the song. Now, a real drummer wouldn't play ghost notes that loud, but a lot of times if you're using live drums, you would separate the snare drum track and have a separate track for the ghost notes so that you can process them separately and bring them up louder. Now, with programmed drums, you don't have to do that. You can just make them louder if you want. The reason I made them louder here is it really adds to this part. If I bring in the bass, you're going to hear how these ghost notes are highlighting all of the muted notes that are happening in the bass and guitar. That adds so much to this part. I could have the drums just kind of do the main hits of the groove, but those ghost notes add a lot of intensity to those muted notes that are happening in the bass and in the guitar, and it really kind of amps up this section and makes it super energetic. So ghost notes are the last step. And once again, studying great drummers to see where they use ghost notes is the best way to do this. But ghost notes are a really good way to make your drums even more realistic. It's kind of like the last step. If I hear music with programmed drums that has a lot of ghost notes and they're programmed well, that's a clue to me that someone knows what they're doing when it comes to programming drums. So there's a couple of quick tips to make your programmed drums sound better. As I mentioned, this is quite a process that took me a long time to get good at, years in fact. So take a couple of these tips and put them into use in your own music and let me know if they helped you. And as always, if you enjoyed this lesson, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share. Till next time, stay proggy.